Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. If this show is about anything, it's about liberty. And one aspect of liberty is freedom of speech. So today's guest is an absolute expert in the area of freedom of speech. So he's here to talk to us about it. He's a criminal defense and a civil liberties litigator. He's the co-founder of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, originally the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. He's written op-eds for the Boston Globe and for the Wall Street Journal, and he's also the author of numerous books, including 3 Felonies a Day. Harvey Silverglate, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
It is an absolute honor to have you here. You call yourself a free speech absolutist.
Yes.
What does that mean?
That means that I think that free speech is so important that it should not have any exceptions to it, with the exception of a few areas that have been laid out by the Supreme Court of the United States. For example, falsely yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. That's frequently misstated as yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. If there's a fire in a crowded movie theater, you want to yell fire. But falsely yelling fire, because that would cause a destructive scramble to the exits. I don't like the exception of libel and slander, but I accept it. The reason I don't like it is because I would much rather have a regime that goes as follows. If you defame somebody, libel being in writing, slander being orally, I think that the Supreme Court would be wise to issue a ruling saying the following: that you should be given 3 days to issue a retraction rather than simply be subject to a defamation suit right away. And if you issue a retraction, then the defamation suit should not be allowed to go forward. So I have a limited acceptance of the current doctrine on defamation. But I am a free speech absolutist. I believe that you should be able to insult people. You should be able to say things that upset a lot of people. The solution to this is that the person that you insult has a right to insult you back, or has a right to defend himself or herself against the insult. I'm very upset by the current trend, for example, in college campuses, where if one student says something to another that upsets a student, the student who has done the upsetting is suddenly brought up on charges because he or she has dented the ego of a classmate. These are absurd. These are absurd proceedings that result more because there are so many administrators on college campuses that it certainly makes no sense and is not consistent with academic freedom.
You brought up an interesting point to me, because you say brought up on charges, but you don't mean criminal charges, right? You mean like brought before a school board or some such thing as that?
Correct.
So the way that I look at it, right, is that if it's a private college or a private university, I've always looked at free speech as something only the government can violate. So if a private college or a private university only wants certain speech on its campus, it seems to me it would violate their freedom of speech to tell them they have to allow whatever speech is taking place. How am I wrong about that?
Well, you are wrong because, like it or not, and I don't like it, but it's a fact of life, virtually every private American college and university takes federal money. There are a couple of exceptions. I believe the exceptions are some religious schools which refuse to take federal money. But because they take federal money, they are subject to constitutional limitations. I don't like that, but it is a fact of life.
So that wouldn't then apply. Well, that's the inherent problem I think that we have is everybody's got their hand out, it seems, for the government, which then allows that sort of exception to come into play. Well, you take our money, we can tell you what to do. Because what I'm going to ask you next is the social media thing, because people claim that Twitter or Facebook are censoring people, but it's their platform. So I don't consider it censorship. Now, when the government is telling them or that they ought to be censoring certain information or not allowing information on, whatever, that's a big problem. But the problem then is to go after the government, not to criticize the private companies. So in that sense, like if a person owns a restaurant, for instance, and that person doesn't want to serve cake for whatever reason, they don't like guys named Liebowitz with a colic in the front of their hair, and they say, "Get the hell out of here! We're not serving you a cake." It seems that should be their right to do so. So you're not saying that the government should be able to tell any private entity that they have to allow speech on their premises. The reason you make an exception for schools is because the schools are so deeply funded by the federal government.
Correct. I do not believe that Twitter or Facebook should be subject to any government constriction with regard to what they say or not. Of course, they're subject to libel and slander laws, but they are not subject, they should not be subject to government control. In the old days, the telephone company was subject to certain restrictions because the theory was it used the wires of interstate communication and therefore was subject to some federal control. I never liked that. As a liberal libertarian, I didn't like that. But Facebook and Twitter and so forth, they're free to engage in whatever they want. And they can let somebody have a voice on their lines, or they could prohibit somebody from having a voice. By having enough of these kinds of outlets, if somebody is slandered on one or misrepresented on one platform, they can go on another platform to answer. So as long as there are multiple platforms, this should not be a problem. The old days when the AT&T had a monopoly, it was the only telephone company, and therefore, if something was said, on some line that was, from AT&T, you had no, if AT&T. I represented the Boston Phoenix once, an alternative newspaper in Boston. They had sex ads. Men or women would advertise and saying, we would like to have, a racing night with somebody, reply here. And the New England Telephone Company cut off and they had phone lines so you can call in order to make a date for whatever kind of sexual activity you happen to like to participate in. Men, women, animals, everything. And the phone company cut them off, saying that this was a prostitution service. And I brought a lawsuit on behalf of the Phoenix in the state superior court, and we won. We won because the court found that the phone company had a monopoly. The Phoenix couldn't go to any other company. And having a monopoly, it has to take all comers. This was all lawful activity, and it was not like advertising for crime. And we won that case. Now it would be different because there are so many multiple. The phone company, as a result of a federal antitrust suit, no longer has a monopoly. We now have all manner and kind of companies that will offer you phone service.
You mentioned slander and libel a couple times, and I first of all think that they're probably used way too much. I'm not even sure they should be exceptions at all. I tend to think they should be, but I'm open to being convinced. But I had an experience with libel in that a friend and I served 25 years in prison. And while in prison, a friend of mine and I wrote a book criticizing the prison system. Now, obviously, we were two convicted felons, and our word is, going to be suspect. So, in order to rectify that, what we did was we named times, dates, people as much as we possibly could. Correctional officers' name, counselors' names, whatever, knowing that this stuff takes place on camera. And therefore, if anybody really wanted to check, they could go look it up. The problem came when it was time to publish. And the publisher that we went to was afraid to publish. They said, well, this is libel. We said, well, no, it's not. We're telling the truth. And they said, no, what you're going to have to do is change all the names, change your names, and change the name of the place where this stuff took place at. But that would have defeated the whole purpose, because now we're not exposing anything. It might as well be a work of fiction. And then we did our research, and we found New York Times v. Sullivan. We put together a really strong argument, but the publishers simply wouldn't do it because they were so afraid of a lawsuit. Is that common, one? And two, is that a real problem with having the libel and slander exceptions?
Yeah, one of the problems with the legal system is if there were a simple and quick way of getting rid of a suit, like a frivolous lawsuit, then you could really blame a publisher for, in your case, it was clearly constitutionally protected. There should have been no problem at all. I don't think that the publisher was worried so much about losing the case, because no lawyer with a half a brain would advise them that they were going to lose that case. The problem is that the judicial system is so drawn out and so lengthy and so expensive that there is a penalty for being sued for defamation, even if you're going to win eventually. You're talking about tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees, 2 or 3 years. And that's a result of the fact that the legal system doesn't provide quick ways to terminate some of these cases.
So in a case like, say this interview ends and someone asks you and you publicly say, God, that Liebowitz, what a horrible interviewer, he sucked. Obviously that's protected. But if I file a lawsuit, now you have to respond and defend it. And I can, if I push this thing, ultimately make you engage me in this process, right?
Correct.
Yeah. See, that seems ridiculous to me.
It is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I'm a lawyer.
Yeah. It seems like the risk of allowing people to slander and libel one another is less than having that sort of a process in place, because I can defend myself. If somebody says something about me, if you say that about me and I think it's not true, I just say, hey, look, watch the tape. You can check it. If someone says about you, this guy's no good, he's a liar, you can come out and say, well, listen, I've got friends, family, I've got a reputation going back 50, 60 years, whatever. You can defend yourself in the same public where you were criticized. But if it's got to be in the court of law, this is just a nightmare.
Correct.
Okay. So you say that the freedom of speech is the most important right that we have. Why?
Because it's a fundamental for securing all the others. If you have another right violated, your right to vote is being violated. Your right to freedom of search and seizure is being violated. One of the ways, and the most effective and the quickest and the least expensive way of redressing these grievances is through publicity, through embarrassing the people who have deprived you of rights, and having them subject to public opinion, public opprobrium, public scrutiny, journalistic scrutiny. So it is the single most important right. And if that is taken away, then everything else pales in insignificance.
What do you think is the biggest threat today to freedom of speech?
Well, it depends on which forum you're talking about. I think that the biggest problem we have now in terms of the long-term health of freedom of speech is our schools, including our colleges, where the notion is that if one student says something to another student that hurts the student's ego, that should be the subject of a disciplinary matter. If you say something to a gay student, you say something to a woman, you say something sexist, you say something racist, that somehow then you go before a dean and you're charged with what's called harassment. Well, that isn't harassment. And you get disciplined in school. And if you're in a private school, it's much harder to redress in court. Not impossible. As I said earlier, if the school takes public funds, it's subject to some restrictions. But I think that the campuses are treating students like hothouse flowers. They're not. If a student is called a name, student can call a name back. Besides, I was born and raised in Brooklyn. We used to have a slogan: "Sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never harm me." And it's true now as it was when I was a kid.
It seems like I've heard you talk about the importance of open discourse, especially you're talking about 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds just heading to school. And it seems if that's the type of country that we're heading towards, or maybe, that we're already there, even if it's not a free speech issue, even if it's just like what Tocqueville talked about, where he said, the public censure and it can also be a powerful mechanism for suppression. But if people are so afraid to hear ideas that they differ with, it just seems like that's headed toward a very bad place. Because if I differ with somebody markedly and we end up having a debate, maybe we come together, I adjust some of my views, she adjusts some of hers, or maybe she convinces me entirely, or maybe a third party hears the debate and changes his mind. It just seems that you're suppressing all of that out of the fear that somebody's feelings are going to be hurt. Sometimes it's not even an insult. It's an idea that they find offensive.
Well, first of all, in a free society, if you're not willing to have your feelings hurt, you should really move to Russia, because the whole notion of free speech is somebody's ego, somebody's feelings are going to be hurt, somebody's going to lose the debate, going to lose that verbal battle, and there are winners and losers. If you happen to lose one, you just lick your wounds and you go back in the ring. That's the price of living in a free society. There are lots of benefits living in a free society, but you have to be willing to have a thick enough skin to live in a free society.
Sure.
My gripe about college campuses is it is trying to create a generation of hothouse flowers. It's very dangerous for our democracy.
I've told people 25 years in prison, I was relatively secure and safe on a regular basis. I didn't have a lot of threats coming my way. And I'll tell you, I would take freedom over safety any day of the week. It's such an easy choice that I can't even fathom people who, not even physical safety, but their feelings, like this person insulted my hair or my ethnicity or my race. I mean, the other day on Facebook, I was debating somebody about conspiracy theories, and somebody comes out and says, well, look at his last name. That should tell you everything you need to know, pointing to the whole idea that Jews are behind, global banking, conspiracy, whatever. what the hell do I care? You know what I mean? This guy's an idiot. I don't, if he wants to think that, he's going to think it whether he's allowed to say it or not. And he's going to find somebody to say it to regardless. So what difference does it make? Like, I can't, that's something I just don't grasp. That degree of sensitivity where we're willing to sacrifice liberty to just be protected from everything we find uncomfortable.
Yep. Yeah, the law doesn't allow protection of from discomfort. That's quite clear.
Well, it's a good thing too. So to change the subject a little bit, I heard you say that you're for abolishing the FBI.
Yes.
And I say change the subject a little bit because the FBI has done a lot, from what I understand, to suppress freedom of speech and the right to privacy. But what is the argument for just getting rid of it?
Getting rid of them is this. From the day of its creation by John Edgar Hoover, the FBI has been a corrupt, anti-liberty organization from inception. It has a culture. It is, in my view, impossible to change the culture. Do we need a federal investigation organization? Probably we do. However, it should not be the FBI. What we have to do is completely abolish it. Fire the director, fire all the agents, get rid of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and start a new agency with a different name, different agents, and a different director, in the hopes that you will therefore get rid of the culture that J. Edgar Hoover started. And so I understand, I'm not unrealistic, that we need a federal criminal investigative organization, but it's got to take radical steps to get rid of that culture of lying and cheating and thieving and setting people up. I have the following situation arises in my law practice. I get a call from an FBI agent. Mr. Silverglate, we'd like to interview your client. I said, sure. Could you bring him up to FBI headquarters? I said, no. We'll do it in my office. You want to come to my office? Well, okay. They come in with two agents. Why two? Always two. This is by regulation. One asks the questions and the other one takes notes. Those notes are then typed up back in the office in a report called a Form 302. That is the official record of the questions and the answers. I have never seen a 302 that's accurate. The 302s are always what the agents wanted to hear more than what they actually heard. So when the agents come into my office, and here's why I insist it be done in my office, I have a tape recorder on the table. I said, okay, let's go. Ask the first question. I pushed the on button. I said, Mr. Silverglate, we have a regulation. We're not allowed to have these recorded. This is true, by the way. Can you imagine a regulation prohibiting the tape recording of interviews and relying only on the notes and the 302 report? I said, oh, this is really too bad because I have a policy of my own. My policy is to never allow a client to be interviewed by a police officer, an FBI agent, or anybody else other than his mother, that when it's not recorded. And so we're going to have to end this interview now. Bye-bye. Thanks for coming.
I think to me, it rings so true when you talk about how they make it's a 302, you said, right? And they make it say what they want to say. I went to trial. I was 21 years old and I was guilty as hell. I'm not claiming innocence. However, everybody that testified at my trial lied. The cops that took the stand lied.
Yep.
And like I said, I was guilty. I'm not claiming innocence, but it just made me think, well, geez, even the person that testified on my behalf lied. And I'm just like, how can anybody really expect to get any type of justice? I mean, I was like, if I were innocent in that situation, I would have been mad as hell. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's terrible. It's what Alan Dershowitz and I call testifying.
Yeah, I mean, in a court of law, it's a little off topic, but they give this question every time somebody pleads guilty. Were you promised anything? Everybody in the courtroom knows that the guy who's pleading guilty has been promised a given sentence. The judge knows it, the prosecutor knows it, the defense attorney knows it, and everybody just goes along with it. And
Can I tell you something?
Sure.
For decades, I have refused to engage to take a client who is going to plead guilty and make a deal, because I refuse to answer that question with a lie. It's exactly why. If someone wants to go to trial, I'll take the case. If somebody wants to make a deal, I say there are loads of lawyers in town who represent you.
Why is that allowed, though? I mean, when everybody knows that it's a lie. I mean, why not just change the rule and just say, were you promised something? Yes, I was promised something.
The reason it's allowed is that the courts, state and federal, in order to function, have to provide a very, very strong incentive to keep people from going to trial. And the strong incentive is if you go to trial, your sentence is 8 times or 10 times,
Sure.
10 times as long. There's a word for that. You know what it is? Extortion.
Getting screwed?
No, extortion.
Extortion, yeah.
Extortion.
Sure. I mean, I remember going to trial and they originally offered me 18 years and I didn't take it. The reason I didn't take it is because I knew I could beat one of the charges at trial. I was guilty of the charge I beat, but I knew I could beat it. And given that they were offering me 18 years for that charge, I'm thinking, okay, I'll beat that charge. But even though I beat the worst charge, they ended up giving me 9 more years than what they had offered me originally, and it just seems like you said, it's extortionary. But yeah. I want to get back to the FBI for a second, because I want you to give me a real life example where you've seen or heard of them being corrupt. Now, I've heard of plenty, especially during the Hoover thing and talking to people that I know and other criminals and inmates who have dealt with them. But you saying it carries a lot more weight than me saying it.
Well, there's a difference between there's 2 types of corruption. There's financial corruption. We've had many scandals here in Boston with the Boston FBI with financial corruption. There was a period when they were on the payroll of organized crime, for God's sakes. I mean, real scandals. And then there's a different kind of corruption, career advancement if you get more convictions. And that's one of the incentives for the agents to phony up these 302 reports. So there are 2 types of corruption, FBI agents. And federal prosecutors know it, but they pretend it doesn't exist. Judges know it, especially since so many judges are former federal prosecutors, but they pretend they don't know about it. It's a real corruption of the system. Yet if the judges don't reward pleas of guilty, they can't handle their dockets. They don't have time to try more than 5% of the cases brought. And that's because we over-prosecute. If we didn't prosecute so many, the judges wouldn't have this problem of clogged dockets. And we would have less incentive for them to get rid of cases through phony means.
Yeah, if we got rid of the drug war, it would probably go a long way. Well, no, not probably.
The drug
definitely,
war alone.
Yeah, it would go a long way
toward the drug cases alone. These drug laws should have been abolished a long time ago. We're just now getting to the point where some states have decriminalized marijuana. Massachusetts has. But that alone, the drug war, clogs the dockets.
So you described yourself, I think, as a liberal libertarian.
Yes.
That's what, and you've been criticizing the FBI. This isn't just, you didn't just pick up this habit last week. I imagine you've been doing this your entire career, criticizing them. Something that's just a pet peeve of mine right now in the present political climate is this. I've heard a lot of people complain about corruption in the FBI, minorities claiming discrimination, they're being prejudiced against. And on the right, and I'm no liberal. I'm a libertarian if I had to take a label. But on the right, they've defended the FBI, they've supported the FBI. No, law enforcement, we're with you 100%. Now that it's their guy, and I mean Trump, who's dealing with the FBI, all of a sudden now, the FBI is no good. They're corrupt. They're this, they're that. And it's just interesting to me that when it was poor people in poor neighborhoods that were suffering at the hands of the FBI, you couldn't care less. But now that your billionaire hero, you think he's being persecuted, it's the end of the world. And I told him the other day, somebody, you're a little late to the party, aren't you? And it just, to me, it's just maddening. And it doesn't mean that their critique of the FBI is unfounded. I just find the hypocrisy incredibly rich.
The worm turns, doesn't it?
Yeah.
No.
Yes, it does.
But
Oh,
the FBI tried to set me up once. You want to hear a great story?
yes.
I was partners with a woman named Nancy Gerder. She was later a federal judge, and she's now a professor at Harvard Law School. We're still friends. And Nancy and I were representing a drug dealer. We get a call from somebody who says, I've got evidence that your clients were not even on Nantucket Island when supposedly they accepted a large quantity of marijuana that came in by boat. So Nancy and I were kind of looked at each other and said, we knew that the clients were on Nantucket and did accept a load of marijuana, but it would have been unprofessional if we didn't at least listen to this guy who claimed to have evidence our client was innocent. So we call him up to the office, and he sits down. Nancy and I are at the table, and he says, to tell you the truth, your clients are guilty. I don't have evidence, but I would be willing, because I like your client, to testify that he was with me somewhere else and not on Nantucket Island at that time. And Nancy and I both stood up and said, you're suggesting perjury. This interview is over. Please leave. And he was kind of surprised. He gets up, he's leaving, and we noticed there's a lump over his right shoulder. He was wired. Now these things are miniaturized, but back then they used what's called Kel sets. They were about the size of cigarette packets, and they had wired it badly. So they put it they put it on his back, and he was wired. The U.S. attorney was setting us up. His name was Robert Mueller.
Wow.
And he was at the time the U.S. attorney in Boston. He later became the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He's done special investigations. I later confronted Mueller, and I said, Bob, that was really awful. You should have known better. He says, well, I get this information from an informant that he thought that you were, susceptible to this, and it was my duty. I said, your duty to listen to a scumbag like this? You knew he was lying. Anyway, so Mueller and I did not have good relations after that. And I'll tell you something else. The way they used to get the mafia, so if you walked into a mafia meeting, you would be searched because they figured you might have been wired. They search everywhere except one place they wouldn't search, your crotch. And the reason is that they were sort of these macho males, and they were very sensitive about touching the crotch of another male. So the FBI put the listening devices in the crotches of the informants and put away a lot of mafia people because they would not search a man's crotch. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, it is. Wow. I don't even know what to say. Okay, I got 10 minutes left with you. So I got to ask you, news of the day, the federal indictment of Donald Trump, is it legitimate?
Okay. First of all, I think it's legitimate in terms of laying out a federal crime. And of course, it's very easy to lay out a federal crime. I've written a book called Three Felonies a Day, How the Feds Target the Innocent. Because of the nature of federal criminal law, you can manage to tease out a crime over almost any activity. If you ask me, if I was in Providence on Thursday and I say no, and you're a federal agent, and I was in Providence, but I didn't want to go because to tell you about it because I'm married and it was my girlfriend, in Providence. That is a lie. You've lied to an agent. That's a federal crime. Little things like that. And so it's very easy to lay out. I wrote this book, Three Felonies a Day. My thesis was that every law-abiding citizen violates 3 federal crimes a day. It doesn't even know it because the law is so encompassing. But the reason I think the Trump indictment is problematic is this. He is now vying for the Republican nomination for president. And they are looking, this is now the Democrats who are in charge, they are looking to disable him from running for office. And they figure this is the way to do it. I call it interfering with an honest democratic election.
Okay.
There's a 5-year statute of limitations. They could wait 5 years to bring this charge. Instead, they're doing it now. It is a political prosecution. I have no sympathy for Trump. I think Trump is a sociopath. I don't like him. I had dealings with him decades ago when I represented Leona Helmsley. Long story I won't go into. I think he's a liar, a cheat. However, this is a democratic society. It is not up to the Department of Justice to decide who gets to run for president. They have plenty of time to wait until, if he gets the nomination, then there's going to be an election. The election could be over before the statute of limitations expires. If he wins, he's going to pardon himself. Let's face it. If he doesn't win, there's plenty of time to indict him. So I think that this is a terrible, terrible, cynical move by the Department of Justice. Mind you, I don't think Trump is fit to be president of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
But that is not the issue.
There's 3 theories that I've heard in defense of Trump here. What you just laid out, I don't have an issue with that. I think he broke the law because I've read the indictment. I've looked at the Presidential Records Act, and I think he's guilty. What you just said,
I'm not arguing his innocence.
No, I know. But I want to ask you 3 specific things that have been said to me. One is that he, as president, he can issue a standing order to declassify all materials that come before him. Another theory that I just listened to a little while ago, I think the guy's name was Robert Barnes, and he said that the president once there's classified information, once he takes it out of there, it's declassified. He can do whatever he wants with it. And another theory is that he can declassify even after he leaves the White House. Is there any truth to any of that? Because every time I tell somebody to point to a law, they can't. This guy Barnes says it's implicit in Article 2 of the Constitution, which I think is ridiculous.
Well, the answer to your question is whatever 5 justices of the Supreme Court decided. So anything goes. And I think that there is a plausible argument that certainly while in office, that the president can declassify, that it's inherent in the presidential power. And whether or not I'm right depends on what 5 justices in the Supreme Court decide. But of course, that to me is not the deciding issue. The deciding issue is the timing. It is obviously political. And the Biden administration should be ashamed of itself.
Okay. Well, thank you so much again for coming today. Is there anything that I didn't let you say or you didn't get to that you think is important and needs to be said?
Well, you can join the Libertarian Party, or you could be like me. I'm a member of the Libertarian Party. Now, I don't agree with everything because I am a social Democrat. That is, I believe in Social Security. I believe in certain protections so people they can't fall below a certain bottom. In this respect, I disagree with the libertarians, but on liberty issues, they're the thing. I just gave a lecture to the annual convention of the Massachusetts Libertarian Party last month. They know that I differ with them on certain social and economic issues, but on liberty issues, we were 100% in tune with one another. Life's complicated. It's hard to be an absolutist, and I'm not an absolutist. I'm an absolutist pretty close on free speech. But on other things, I have some positions that the Republicans sponsor, some positions the Democrats sponsor, some positions the Libertarians sponsor. Why people say to me, "You're inconsistent." Well, I'm not inconsistent. I just use rational analysis to pick and choose my issues.
Okay. Is there any place that people can find you? Do you have a website or a blog or
Yep,
anything
Harvey
like that?
Silverglate, harveysilverglate.com. The hardest part is spelling Silverglate because the immigration officers at Ellis Island, instead of naming my grandparents on my father's side, it was a Russian name. It sounds so like Zilberglit. So they transliterated it into English as Silverglate. They could have said Silvergate. It would have been easy because both are English words, silver and gate, or Silverglade, D. They're both English words, silver and glade. Instead, the idiots made the name Silverglate, which is constantly misspelled.
I can imagine. Just to be clear, it's Silver Glate, Glate.
T as in Thomas E, yes.
Okay.
.com.
Thank you so much for being here. For now, this is the Rational Egoist. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Until next time.